So hi everyone, I finally decided to make a video blog. But before starting, I wanted to give a Mexican hello to all my homies out there. So for this blog, I will be drawing connections between three different items. Chapter 2 of Composition-Rhetoric by Robert Connors. It's titled Shaping Tools, Textbooks, and the Development of Composition Rhetoric. Chapter 5 of Fragments of Rationality by Lester Fagley. It's titled Coherent Contradictions, the Conflicting Rhetoric of Writing Textbooks. And Chapter 4 of A Teaching Subject by Joseph Harris, titled Error. So, yes, I am on a car, by the way. So, the history of rhetoric textbooks begins like this. In the beginning, Aristotle and company wrote long, beautiful, complex treatises on rhetoric. And one day in 18th century America, non-professionalized people like graduate students were placed in English 101 to teach composition to underprepared writers. Because these non-professionalized teachers were also unprepared, they needed something or someone to tell them what to do. And they thought about the treatises on rhetoric, but the long, beautiful, complex treatises were too long and too complex to actually teach in a classroom of bored students. However, the publishing industry saw a great opportunity to make a buck and obtained rhetoricians and many times even people not trained in rhetoric to write textbooks. So the treatises were splintered, broken, and fragmented into various smaller books called textbooks. And these textbooks simplified rhetoric and were made into handbooks of rules and drill books with many, many exercises and workbooks that let you write on the page. The publishers decided that too many exercises and drills and rules were not a good thing. So they slashed the 350 rules into a workable 100. And in place of the treatises, ornamentation and poetic flourishes, they supplied glossy covers, colored pages, and made it so that you can't buy used textbooks. And for a time, composition instructors were happy with the textbooks as the teacher. Until everyone discovered that students were still basic writers. We live in terrible times, obviously. So what should have been our classroom tools have become the teacher and trapped us in uncritical ways of thinking. But if we will keep training teachers to stand by themselves, we can continue to reinvent textbooks in the image of their best nature as our tools, not crutches we depend upon for all support. That's a quote from page 111. And textbooks are beginning to appear that concentrate on learning the process of writing rather than on learning abstract concepts about writing. And if we continue on the right path, it is prophesied one day that Aristotle will return bearing his treatise on rhetoric in hand and will cast out all textbooks and throw them into the fire. Textbooks themselves are sort of schizophrenic, or as Lester Fagley calls them, coherent contradictions. That is, they promise to teach the student writer the process of composition, but end up embedding him into a rational, liberal, non-contradictory subjectivity in which all the student's contradictory experiences are resolved and dealt with through critical distance in a nice, polished writing product. In other words, what is important is not the discovery of an underlying rationality, but the presentation of the self as a reasonable, authoritative, and objective identity. Textual coherence is privileged because it reduces conflict to a matter of textual tensions. That's a quote from page 162. In other words, these textbooks say that if the writer portrays an image of himself as a rational subject, then the substance of his writing doesn't matter. What's important for Fagley as a process theorist is the contradictions in our writing because they reflect the contradictions in our experiences. Fagley would prefer that students elaborate on the contradictions or just leave them as they are in the writing. Contradictions make our anger and frustrations or any other emotions powerful. And to resolve these into non-contradictory, objective, rational statements is to mold us into docile bodies. Fagley is not saying that textbook writers are evil manipulators a la Mr. Burns, but that there is an internal struggle that gets written into textbooks. The internal struggle between the writer, who is probably a radical theorist on writing, and the demands of the publisher, who wants traditional forms of writing taught in their textbooks to ensure sales. So third section here, composition textbooks were written specifically to address error in student writing. To the extent that you believe that thesis, textbooks are therefore disciplinary in nature. Joseph Harris tells us that however much we may despise the old way of looking for nothing but error in student writing, we cannot not correct student error. He argues that we must think of error within the larger issue of writer authority and credibility. If you make spelling, grammatical, or punctuation mistakes, people may not believe what you have to say. That's what we need to teach students. Personally, I appreciate Mike Rose's strategy for dealing with error. He shifts focus away from it and instead teaches ideas, habits of thinking, strategies of thinking, academic discourse, and argumentative stance. And actually, it's not a focus away from, but to another area of error, a much more important area. By the way, if anyone has not read Mike Rose's Possible Lives, I recommend it as one of those truly inspirational books that you will not find in the inspirational section of your local Barnes and Nobles or Borders. So I figure I'll end here with some questions for all of you. Please reply to this blog down there somewhere. It's much appreciated. So questions. What do you think about textbooks, and what has been your experience with them? Their price, their look, their use. How do you plan to use them in the classroom? Do composition textbooks merely reflect the professional status of composition teachers, as Connors argues they do? Do textbooks teach writing in ways that reflect the status quo? Are textbooks embedded in a long history of institutional practices and discourses that are themselves mechanisms of power? Do handbooks of rules and drill exercise books merely discipline and castigate basic writers? And I'll probably get a lot of answers to this last question, but what do you think about our campus textbook store?